Allahu Akbar.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونشكره ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد محمدا عبده ورسوله. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. So since this is the parenting session, I know most of you have been up from the crack of dawn, I'm sure, with your children waking you up, regardless of their age. I want to start my talk picking up with a similar thread that Brother Abdurrahman just spoke about. He began by speaking about adab and the importance of adab and the potential loss of adab that we may be seeing today. Throughout the generations, generation after generation, we often see the older generation trying to label the youth. And so we hear things such as, our youth are going through a crisis of faith. Our youth are going through a crisis of identity. Our youth are going through a crisis of adab. But the reality is that as we put these labels on generation after generation, we don't often pause and look at our own internal structure and ask ourselves, what crisis may we be going through? Is there a crisis where we are not connecting, where we are not understanding? Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu tells us, do not raise your children in the way that you were raised, because every generation has its own difficulties and its own challenges. And so when we try to place what we are familiar with, what we grew up with, and view the lens of our own children from that frame, we're always going to find difficulty. We're always going to find a lack of connection. Every generation has their own song and their own lyrics that applies to their parents. I was a child of the 80s, and so we grew up with the song Parents Just Don't Understand. And I'm sure today there's another song that has similar lyrics or another catchphrase, the idea that parents just don't get it. And this idea that parents just don't get it often rears its head in those teenage years. And I know, right now, as a mother of a teenager myself and a preteen child and a younger child, when I tell people, oh, one of my children is a teenager, I always get the, oh, poor you. Oh, how's that going? Almost as if having a teenager is like being afflicted with something. And just as Brother Abdurrahman explained to us, the gift of our children is not a temporary gift where they're only a gift to us at the young age, but they're a gift to us throughout their years. But just as they are a gift to us, they are also a test to us. And they're a test to us at the young age when we can't get them to sit still in a lecture. And they're a test to us at the older age when we still can't get them to sit still in a lecture. And they're a test to us at an even older age when they enter marriage and a whole different phase of their life. So الْمَالُ وَالْبَنُونَ زِينَةُ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. So even though our wealth and our children are an adornment of this world, in our adornment there is a test. And we must not only embrace the adornment, but embrace the test as well and understand it in order to connect with it and to connect with our children. So why are those teenage years talked about as that, ooh, you have a teen? What surrounds the teenage years? What is the mystery with the teenage years? As our children enter that age, that stage in life when they are trying to figure out who they are, when they are trying to carve their own identity, when they are trying to live that life that is somewhere in between childhood and adulthood, they are going to come across roadblocks. And those are roadblocks that we might have difficulty sometimes comprehending. The self becomes very important in the teenage years. And the nafs, as it's trying to emerge, as it's trying to shape itself, as it's trying to become that which it will be into adulthood even, goes through its own struggles. And so the youth go through both an internal struggle as well as an external struggle. When they're living in a world that is telling them it's all about you, love you, do you, be you, and then they're going home to a family that's saying it's all about us. We must eat dinner together. We must go to this lecture together. We must go visit these people at this time together. There is a conflict. Because we're living in a very individualistic time. We're living in a selfie world. And if you enter any of the youth conference sessions, you'll see that many of the teens are turning around and lifting up their phone and saying, selfie. And I think maybe we should try that in the main hall and understand, where is this desire to have this selfie? Where is this narcissistic, or what we view as narcissistic, feeling coming from? And we see it in our society. Just recently, Kim Kardashian published a book called Selfish, and it's a book of selfies. And she's sold over 1 million copies already before it even hit the shelves. Why? Because this is what society is telling our youth to do. This is what society is telling our children from a young age to believe in. And yet we are often contradicting that, rather than directing our youth to understand how they can use that do you line and be you without contradicting their faith, without letting the nafs al-ammara overtake them and pull them away from the deen. Our children want approval. And Brother Abdurrahman did a great job of talking about how we sometimes fail to provide them with what they are looking for. They want the world to think they're okay. But at what point do they stop thinking of their parents as their world? We have the guidelines for tarbiyah in our deen. We know that the first 7 years of childhood, the child is like the master. What does that mean? In those first 7 years, the child knows that they have us wrapped around their little pinky. A young child, if he was or she was to run across the stage right now, at the age of 3 or 4, we might all say, "Aww." Now imagine if that same child was age 13 or 14 and jumped up on the stage and started, wiggling around. It wouldn't be awe anymore. It would be, "Get down here, you're embarrassing me. What were you thinking?" Because during those early years, age 0 to 7, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts that rahmah in our heart, not only towards our own children, but towards the children of others. I cannot tell you how many young women with strollers walking through the bazaars get stopped, more than Brother Na'man Ali Khan even maybe, to be told, "Oh, your baby's so cute. Oh, so adorable, mashallah." We have that rahmah, that sense of affection with no strings attached towards the child during those early formative years. And it's there for a reason. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to use those formative years to connect with our children, to allow our children to see us as the center of the world, and to learn from us, by viewing through our actions. Because at that age, our children are so impressionable. And so we can give them the tools during that time to help them make sense of the world. So when your child at age 5 comes into the car after school and you say, "How was your day?" And the child says, "Well, I did this in kindergarten and I dropped this crayon and it was a blue crayon and I got upset because I really wanted the seafoam crayon, but the seafoam crayon was missing, and then Amina took the crayon and then she took my barrette and I couldn't find my barrette." And stop yourself from just saying, "Okay, I'm busy now, I'm on the phone, okay." Because this is the time when your child is learning that you will listen to them, that you want to listen to them. So that when you fast forward to those teenage years, when your child is 14, 15, 16, and they enter the car after school and you say, "How was your day?" And they say, "What'd you do?" "Nothing." "What'd you learn?" "Nothing." "No, nothing." And you're getting those snippets of words. Recognize that if you open the door to listening, to showing your child that they're important during those formative years, then when they are ready to talk in their teenage years, they will know that you're there. They'll know that you want to listen. They'll know that you are willing to understand. But if you don't take the time out in those early years to listen, then don't expect them to want to talk to you in those later years. When we look at the second stage of tarbiyah, we know that from the age of 7 to 14, the child is said to be like the slave. Now that doesn't mean that that's the point where you have them cleaning the bathrooms every day and mopping the floors. even though chores are definitely a good way to teach responsibility. But it means that that is the age of discipline. From the age of 7 to 14, your child is looking for boundaries. Your child is looking to understand the world around them, not simply by viewing your actions, because now they've gone out into the world. Now the parents are no longer the center of their world, but they have friends, and they have a social life, and they have social media. And this is a whole new world for them. And even though they may fight you at every turn and say no, why do you say no? Say yes, I want to do this, why can't I do this? Understand that this is the age of discipline, that this is where you need to put in the boundaries. And your children want those boundaries, whether or not they realize it. They want to know that you've got their back. And sometimes they want to hear no. Sometimes they want to hear that you're interested enough in what they have to say, that you will help them and you will guide them. But we can't say no to our children if we don't understand what we're saying no to. So the child who is 13, and you say to that child, you cannot have any type of social media, and forget Facebook and Twitter, but I'm talking Snapchat and Kik and Instagram and Pinterest. And you tell that child, no, you can't have it. And the child says, but why? All my friends do. If you have never gone onto that social media, if you do not have a Facebook account, a Twitter account, if you've never tested out Snapchat and Instagram and Kik, you will not have a good answer to that. If your answer is just, well, I heard that it's not good, it's equivalent to you telling a child, look both ways before you cross the street, but you yourself have never crossed the street. Then how will your child know that you know? Experience what your child experiences. Know what your teen is going through. Understand the dangers rather than just blindly responding with a no. And speak your children's language. You know, in an earlier youth conference session that I had last evening, I began my talk with some of the terminology that some of my high school students will use around me. And it was funny because I remember a few years ago here at ICNA as well, I had given a talk on the language of teens. And I remember throwing out words such as LOL and TTYL. And just a few short years later, I realized how outdated that language has even become. And instead, now it's all about cray-cray and ratchet and all sorts of other words that the teens are using, or no words at all, going like this and this, fist pump. And it's a completely different language. And yet we think as parents sometimes, I'm cool, I'm current, I learned the texting language. But the language is consistently changing. And with the changes in language, there is a change in attitude, and there is a change in perspective, and there is a change in the way that our children interact with one another. The rate of technology changing today is unprecedented. There is a new technology almost every month. There is a new iPhone every couple of months. There's a new type of a device or a new social media occurring at a rapid rate. We must familiarize ourselves with them. We must know what's out there in order to understand it and in order to teach it to our children and to recognize where to draw the boundaries. Then we reach the final stage of tarbiyah, the age from 14 to 21, where the child is said to be like the vizier, which means the advisor. This is the point where your children still need you to be parents. So many times at that age, I will see parents who say, well, I'm my child's friend. Be your child's friend, but be their parent as well. And come to your child when your child at that age comes to you and says, Mom, I want to go to the prom. Mom, I want to go to this party. Dad, I want to buy this outfit. Dad, I want to do this. Ask your child, why? Why do you want to go to this party? Why do you want to go to the prom? Don't just simply respond to everything with haram and make the entire faith a faith that is viewed by our children as if it is one big no. Understand why the child wants to go to the party. And if your child says, well, I want to go to the party because it's cool and it's fun and all my friends are going to be there, ask yourself, have you given your child opportunities to find cool and fun and where all the friends are going to be. Opportunities where you've opened your door and told your child, I want your friends to come. I want your friends to visit. Because it's not enough to friend your child. You have to befriend the friends of your child as well. You have to know who your child is interacting with, because once you pass that pivotal age of formation, 0 to 7, you're no longer the center of their world. And we know that Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam has told us that the friend can be so influential in one's life that if you befriend a blacksmith, even if you don't actually work with the blacksmith, some of the bellows and the soot from the blacksmith will stick to you. And if you befriend a perfumier, even if you don't work in making the perfume, some of the sweet scent of the perfume will stick to you. And so it is with friends. If you do not know who your children are hanging out with, whether it is online or in real life, then you are not going to be able to have any type of understanding or connection with your children. Because at that age, when the friends trump the parents, you need to be there and you need to know who the friends are. Brother Abdurrahman made mention of the beautiful story of Sittina Fatima radiallahu anha and her connection to her father. But we need to look back to the younger years to understand how she came to a point to value her father so much, to have such a strong connection with him, that she would cry upon learning that he was about to return to his Lord, and yet she would smile upon learning that she would be the first from Ahlul Bayt to join him. As a child, Sittina Fatima radiallahu anha had the nickname Abiha, the mother of her father, because she cared so much for her father, the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. She looked out for him constantly, and it was a two-way street. The Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when his daughter would enter upon him in a room, he would rise from his seat and ask her to sit in her place. He would kiss her on the forehead, and he would give her that connection, that importance, that feeling that she meant something and was someone. When she was young, Sittina Fatima, around the age of 11 or 12, she saw her father praying on a hilltop, on a mountain. And he was surrounded by the kuffar. And as he prayed, the kuffar reached into a dead camel and pulled out the guts of the camel and threw it upon the back of the Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam. When Sittina Fatima radiallahu anha saw this, she left the home and went up to the mountain and parted the way between the kuffar that surrounded him, and sat near her father as tears streamed down her face, and she cleaned the guts off of the back of her father. When the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam completed his prayer, he turned to his daughter, and he did not tell her, go back to the home, this is no place for you. He didn't tell her, you're a girl, you shouldn't be out here. He wiped her tears and he kissed her on the forehead. And he told her, do not weep, for surely Allah will allow your father to be victorious. So the reciprocal relationship is not one that just appears out of nowhere. It's a relationship that is built upon mercy. It's a relationship that is built upon rahmah. And we see that same relationship that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam had with Ali and with Zayd, who he raised as his own children. We see the connection that he had. And we see that the connection that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam had with his children was a connection of mercy that was the same connection that his relationship to his wives was built upon. Do not underestimate the importance of your relationship with your spouse in raising your children. Do not underestimate the relationship with your community and your family if you are raising your children as a single parent. And if you are raising your children as a single parent and you cannot find that community and you cannot find those to surround yourselves to help you in that tarbiyah, then we as a community have failed you. Because it doesn't take a village to raise a child, it takes an ummah. And when we worry and lament about the fact that our own children have become obsessed with the nafs and the self, we have to stop and ask ourselves, where are we? What are we focusing on? Where are our children learning this? When the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam sat in his room once and he was weeping, so much so that his beard was wet with tears. And the Sahaba entered and they asked him, "For what do you weep?" The Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam answered and said, "I weep for the day when my people will say nafsi, nafsi, nafsi instead of ummati, ummati, ummati." If you feel like you are raising your child alone, whether you are married or not married, whether you're struggling in a family structure that is falling apart, or even if your family structure is sound, but you still are struggling to raise your child, turn to your community, turn to your ummah. It wasn't meant to be done alone. We were meant to work together to raise our children. Brother Abdurrahman also mentioned the beautiful connection between Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam and Sayyidina Ismail. And how when Sayyidina Ibrahim approached his son, his teenage son, to tell him that he was commanded to sacrifice him, the reaction of the son was not, "Oh no, I'm too young." And the reaction of Sayyidina Ibrahim was not, "Let me do something else instead." It was a relationship of ibadah, of receiving a commandment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and carrying it out. But how did Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam come to that point, come to that reaction? We see years before, when Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam was just an infant, and him and Sittina Hajar were taken to the desert upon the commandment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As Sittina Hajar walked behind Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, she asked, "Why do you leave us in the desert?" And Sayyidina Ibrahim did not answer. She asked again, "Why do you leave us in the desert?" And Sayyidina Ibrahim did not answer. And then she asked the third time and said, "Is this a commandment from your Lord?" And Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam answered in the affirmative and said, "Yes, this is a commandment from my Lord." And so Sittina Hajar's response was, "Then surely He will protect us." And when she placed her child on the ground, and Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam began to cry from thirst and began to beat his feet upon the ground, Sittina Hajar radiallahu anha did not sit down beside him and just cry and say, "Well, I'll make dua because Allah is the greatest of all providers, because Allah is the best of all protectors." No, she committed to the sa'i, the striving, back and forth 7 times between 2 mountaintops in the desert. This new mom, the mother of an infant, looked for water. She had that full faith, that tawakkul in her heart that Allah would take care of her and her son, but she did what she had to do. She strove and searched for that water. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, allowed the water to spring. Now if we fast forward and we look at the situation of Sayyidina Ismail when he is approached by his father, and his father says to him, "I have been commanded to sacrifice you." Listen to the words of Sayyidina Ismail alayhi salam. He responded and said, "If this is a commandment from your Lord, then surely He will protect us." So the words of the mother that were said when he was just an infant were echoed again so many years later. Because this is the power of tarbiyah. Because we never know what word we might say, what action we might take that will land in the heart of our children, that will shape who they are, that will make them the adults that they will become. And we see this even with Sittina Maryam radiallahu anha. When she was still in the womb of her mother, Imra'at Imran, she dedicated what was in her womb to the service of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And at a time when no females were ever dedicated to the service of Allah, at a time of monotheism when those who were scholars were men, when the mother of Maryam gave birth to her, she continued with her dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And she said, "I have given birth to a female, and you know what I have given birth to, and the female is not like the male. And yet I still dedicate her to your service." And so she was accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Sittina Maryam was raised in the mihrab, raised to be, in that time of monotheism, to be a religious scholar. And she was chosen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of her faith, because of her purity, and because of her belief in La ilaha illallah and her tawakkul. And so as we raise our children in this generation today, as we raise our teenagers, we do need to love them. We do need to believe in them and instill in them the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as we love them, we need to avoid breaking them. We need to keep ourselves away from that temptation of constantly criticizing, away from that temptation of putting them down with the feeling that we're just making them better. We're just pushing them because we want them to improve. When our children leave our home, and especially our teenagers, there is an entire world out there waiting to break them. There is an entire world out there waiting to tell them they're not good enough, they're not smart enough, they're not nice enough, they're not popular enough, they're not cool enough. And if they don't hear those words from us, that they are more than smart enough, that they are more than cool enough, that they are more than beautiful, then they're going to find someone else to hear it from. When parents come to our counseling center, crying, saying, "My daughter has a boyfriend and she doesn't want to leave him. My son is smoking pot every day. My child is addicted to pornography." And these are things that we hear on a daily basis. And my heart breaks every time I hear this, because Allahu yahdi man yasha. And none of us should ever feel so safe in our tarbiyah to think that our children may not be afflicted or affected by something like this. But all of us must have that sense of tawakkul, that belief, that striving of making our children's lives, of making our tarbiyah a priority, and of connecting with our children in a way where we can stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and we can say that yes, our children were an adornment, yes, our children were a test, but I raised this test in the best way that I could. And I raised this test in a way to love you and to connect with you. And remind your children, especially your teenagers, that when they were young and you dropped them off at daycare or pre-K, and they held onto your hand so tightly, and they said, "Don't leave me." Remind them and let them know that as they entered the school with tears in their eyes, you stood aside and you cried too. That there was a part of you that you felt you lost that day. That there was a part of you that you knew you were sending out into that world, and you sent them out with a fervent dua. And continue to make that dua for your children. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect all of our children. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to be the best parents that we can be. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always guide us and our children. Jazakum Allah khair. Assalamu alaikum.